Good afternoon, and welcome to a special edition of our virtual town hall, the teen edition. This event is being put together by the Colorado High School Democrats, and I'm really grateful to them. I'm going to say this throughout this conversation because as much as we encourage young people to get involved in politics and public life, this is a group of students who are already doing it. They need no encouragement. So even though there is an elephant over my shoulder here, purely decorative, this is an event run by a group of young donkeys. And I'm very delighted to introduce the chair of the Colorado High School Democrats, Spencer Wicox, who will get our proceedings underway. And by the way, if you all are joining us at andrewromanoff.com/live, I want to say thanks. We'll post a rebroadcast of this town hall at andrewromanoff.com/videos. You can also follow along on Twitter or Facebook at andrewromanoff.com, at Romanoff 2020. That's our handle.
Hello, and welcome to the virtual town hall with U.S. Senate candidate Andrew Romanoff, hosted by the Colorado High School Democrats. My name is Spencer. The questions asked today have not been shown to the candidate or their campaign. Only us moderators and the other members of the Colorado High School Democrats Executive Board know what will be asked. Moderating today's town hall are Executive Board members including myself and Elijah Diamond Ainscote, the Diversity Director, and Charlotte Combe, the Vice Chairwoman.
Before we begin, Andrew, would you mind giving us a short introduction of yourself for everyone?
You bet, and thanks again for the opportunity. I appreciate that, Charlotte. So my name is Andrew Romanoff. As you know, I'm running for the United States Senate, hoping to be the Democratic nominee and then replace a fellow named Cory Gardner. The good news is whoever wins the nomination is likely to beat Gardner. His approval rating is down to 34%. I disagree with Senator Gardner on every major issue, on the climate crisis, on healthcare reform, on immigration, on gun violence, how we build an economy and a country that works for everyone. And I hope we'll have a chance to dive into some of those issues. I've laid out my priorities at andrewromanoff.com, and I will announce for the first time on this town hall that we've also laid out a plan on ending police violence. If you go to andrewromanoff.com/priorities, you can see a dozen suggestions that we're putting forward in order to reduce the police brutality, which has horrified the nation. I know we're mourning George Floyd's murder this week, as we should, but we ought to recognize as well that it's not an isolated incident.
Thank you. Now let's get on to our first topic of education. The first question is, do you support school choice? Why or why not?
You know, I have not signed on to any of the proposals that would take public tax dollars and send them to private schools. We have, as Coloradans, pursued choice within the public school system. But to me, at least, the best way to improve student achievement is actually to invest in the things that we know work, like training and hiring and paying top flight teachers, paying them what they're worth, reducing class sizes so more students can get the benefit of individual attention, investing in early childhood education, including high quality preschool and full day kindergarten. I led the fight to fund Colorado's public schools, both by authoring a temporary timeout from the Tabor Taxpayer Bill of Rights constitutional limits, and by teaming up with our state treasurer at the time, Kerry Kennedy, and a whole host of other education advocates to create the largest investment in school construction in state history, a $1 billion plan we call BEST, Building Excellent Schools Today. At the end of the day, to my view at least, the quality of your education should not depend on your income or your zip code or your parents' bank account.
So our next question is, do you support lowering the voting age to 16 for local school district elections?
Yes.
And why is that?
I'm trying to keep my answers shorter. Well, because I think it's one way for us to encourage participation and to recognize that students have a stake in the outcome of those elections. I mean, the truth is, young people have more at stake in the outcome of this election as well, because whether we address the climate crisis or the cost of higher education or healthcare, and you're going to be here longer than I am to deal with those consequences. And I think allowing students to participate in local school board elections is a good place to start.
Great. Next question. What are you planning to do to reform education?
Well, I mentioned some of the proposals earlier, Elijah, and I'll just elaborate a little bit from my own experience. I've taught for many years in Colorado's community college system. I think I was a better teacher when I had fewer students to teach because I could provide more individual attention. And I've seen too many classrooms in Colorado where teachers aren't able to do that, so kids get lost in the shuffle. I also talked to a number of first grade teachers who could tell you which kids had the benefit of high quality early childhood education and which didn't. So that's another priority. Probably the single most important investment we could make is in the earliest years of a child's life. I've also talked to a lot of teachers. I was out on the picket lines with teachers at Denver Public Schools when they were striking for better wages. And I tell you, it broke my heart to hear teachers who loved their job, loved their kids, loved being in the classroom, tell me they wouldn't sign up for this again, in part because too often we've not only shortchanged that profession, but also blame teachers for everything else that society has shortchanged. So I want to make sure that we value teachers, and that means paying them what they're worth. So that's another important place where I think we can make an investment.
Great. And last question of the topic. Do you support increasing funding for the arts, such as performing arts, music, etc.?
I do. You know, it's one of the things, frankly, that enriches our culture and enriches our intellectual capacity. I've talked to a lot of students who tell me that they're bored or dropped out of school, not because they couldn't keep up, but because the things that made school interesting, including the programs you just described, were cut out of the curriculum and the budget.
All right, so now moving on to the next topic of healthcare. What will you do to reform healthcare as a senator?
And this is a key question. It's one of the top priorities for my campaign and a key difference between not only Cory Gardner and me, but also between John Hickenlooper and me. I will say, by the way, I'm disappointed he didn't show up or answer your request to appear. This is today the 20th candidate forum he skipped. If you were here, I'd ask him this question too. So here's my plan. I think what we've got now is a broken model. Today in America, there are, even before the pandemic hit, 28 million people who are uninsured, 44 million who are underinsured, and 500,000 families who are going bankrupt because they can't afford their medical bills. It doesn't have to be that way. It's not this way in other industrialized nations. I'd like to take a lesson from those countries and adopt a universal single payer plan. That means strengthening Medicare by adding some benefits that aren't part of the package now, like dental and vision and hearing and long-term care, strengthening protection for mental health and substance use services, increasing reimbursement rates for Medicare providers, especially in rural and other underserved communities. And then, this is the key, lowering the age of Medicare eligibility to 0 so that everybody can enjoy the benefit of health coverage, which is not happening now. I just want to share with you, if I can, a brief story to illustrate this point, because I know it's easy to get lost in a conversation about millions and millions of people. So I'll just tell you the story of one person. I spent the last 4 years leading a mental health organization, a group called Mental Health Colorado. I did that because of a suicide in my own family, and because I knew that so many other families across the state were being devastated by mental illness or drug addiction. I met a father in those circumstances, a father whose son had deep depression. He experienced a bout of psychosis. He needed treatment. But when his dad submitted a claim to the insurance company, the insurer said no. So the dad appealed the decision, and the insurance company said no. And the dad appealed again, and the insurance company said no. This went on for months until his son killed himself at the age of 14. 3 weeks later, his dad got a letter in the mail from the insurance company reversing its decision and agreeing to cover his late son's treatment. So I will tell you, speaking not just as a candidate, but as a human being, it is profoundly painful to me to have conversations with moms and dads who have lost their kids, not only to a disease that we can treat, but also to the indifference of an industry that bases its profits on its ability to deny as many claims and exclude as many sick people as possible. That's the business model. And it's a great model if you're an insurance company. It's a pretty lousy model for the rest of us. We have to get to a place in this country, like so many other industrialized nations, where your ability to get the care you need doesn't depend on the whims of an insurance company or even the generosity of an employer. I guess that's the last quick point I'll make. Right now, in the middle of this pandemic, it's estimated that as many as 43 million Americans may lose their employer-based coverage. So when Cory Gardner and John Hickenlooper defend this model, I ask, why on earth would you do that? Why would you condemn so many of us to lose our coverage just because we're losing our jobs? What if you want to change your job or start a new business? Why should you lose your benefits on account of that decision? It makes no sense at all unless you actually follow the money and figure out pretty quickly that the nation's biggest insurance companies and drug companies are bankrolling Congress and blocking reform. We've got to end that kind of pay-to-play political system too.
Thank you. And we'll talk about mental health more in depth later on. But for now, let's go back to your Medicare for All plan. Many opponents of Medicare for All claim that it would end up costing too much. Your opponent, Governor Hickenlooper, has called it, quote, a disaster at the ballot box. What is your response to this criticism?
Yeah, look, I think it's a disaster, not just at the ballot box for Americans if you defend a broken system. And I mentioned the number of Americans who are uninsured or underinsured or going bankrupt. I'll mention the most heartbreaking statistic of all, and I think it's an underestimate. At least 35,000 people in the richest nation on the face of the earth die each year because they can't afford to see a doctor. That's immoral. It's indefensible. And it makes no sense to me that anybody, Democrat like Hickenlooper or Republican like Gardner, would defend this broken system. The truth is, it would be cheaper to adopt a plan of Medicare for all. We could save billions of dollars and thousands of lives if we learn from the rest of the world. I'll just share the math with you real quick. So we're spending, on average, about $11,000 per person per year on healthcare in the United States. Other countries, take Japan, Singapore, Switzerland, Taiwan, France, Canada, they're spending closer to $6,000. So we're spending almost twice as much as our competitors. It'd be one thing if we could afford to do that, but we can't. Healthcare costs are the single biggest source of bankruptcy in the United States. It'd be another thing if we were getting health outcomes that were twice as good, but we're not. Our life expectancies aren't longer, our infant and maternal mortality rates aren't lower. We're just leading the world in spending, and we're going broke. Winston Churchill supposedly said, you can always count on the American people to do the right thing after they've exhausted all the other options. So I think we've exhausted all the other options. It's time for us to do the right thing.
Say that you were elected. Would you
Let's just say that.
Would you support filibuster reform in the Senate to help increase the chances of Medicare for All passing?
Yes, I believe we should eliminate the filibuster. I'll try not to filibuster my answer.
All right. What other reform do you think this pandemic has shown us that we need to enact?
Well, gosh, I think it has forced us, or should at least force us, to contemplate everything we're doing, because going back to normal isn't good enough. Business as usual wasn't working. Not when the gap between rich and poor is wider than at any point in 100 years. Not when African-American families hold on average only 1/10 the wealth of white families. Not when we've emitted more pollution in the last 40 years than in all of human history. And so no, I don't think we should settle for the status quo or indulge the kind of incremental reform that my opponents are proposing. So when it comes to healthcare for all, bold climate action, building an economy that works for everyone, I think this pandemic ought to teach us that we need deep structural transformative change in America. That is the heart of my campaign.
All right, and last question of the topic. Do you think safer at home orders should continue?
Well, I think we're not at a place where we can simply reopen the economy and go hog wild again because we don't have a vaccine. We haven't demonstrated enough testing or tracing or isolation or treatment. So I fear a second wave will come. I recognize families and small businesses are struggling now, and I think we ought to do far more to help them weather this storm rather than just dole out the benefits to those at the very top, to giant corporations, for example, or bail them out. I want to make sure that we've got more than $1,200 in a single check to survive, because it's not enough for families in America. But I also want to make sure we have an aggressive plan to conquer this pandemic. And we should talk about this at some point, I hope, take steps to prevent this kind of outbreak from ever occurring again, or at least make it less likely.
All right, so moving on now to our next topic of discussion, the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as criminal justice reform. I guess to start off, are you a supporter of the Black Lives Matter movement, and if so, why?
Absolutely, because I think it is a long overdue recognition of the role that racism has played since well before our nation's founding. This is America's original and persistent sin. So if you look at the history of African Americans in the United States, you see a people who were brought here in chains, subjected to slavery, lynched, murdered, forced to live under segregation, and subject to discrimination to this day. I'll just share with you my own commitment to this cause. When I turned 21, I moved to Montgomery, Alabama to join the Southern Poverty Law Center in its fight against the Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazi groups. I did not expect, by the way, to be having the same fight 30 years later, or to find a president of the United States on the other side, suggesting that there were somehow good people on both sides of this debate. There are not. But in some ways, it was easier to see racism in that form because it wore a hood and burned a cross on your lawn. I took a job at a state civil rights agency a few years later to design and supervise an undercover investigation of employment discrimination. We were trying to ferret out racial bias in the job market, which also persists. So I think if we're serious about not only saying Black Lives Matter as we should, but acting that way, we're going to have to combat racial injustice in every form, from the justice system itself to employment, housing, healthcare, banking, lending, all the places in which these inequalities continue to plague us. We can't simply declare victory when we put a civil rights law on the books unless we actually enforce it.
Okay. What have you actively done to benefit people of color and Black people in particular?
Well, I mentioned a couple of the positions I held in the past. I also maintained this commitment as a state legislator because I supported increased funding for civil rights enforcement. I took a job, as I mentioned, just about 5 years ago now at Mental Health Colorado, in part because I recognize that too often African Americans are denied access to healthcare, including mental health care. There's a disproportionate rate there in which African American families are left without the means they need to combat the healthcare crises that plague us as a country. So I want to close that gap and pursue health equity. And in the course of this campaign, racial justice is a central point. I mentioned earlier, we've laid out a plan today to combat police violence because we know, for example, that African Americans are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police than white people are. And that's, I think, what makes both George Floyd's murder so painful and the protests against it so important, because we recognize that he was not the first by any means, and certainly unless we take action now, will not be the last African American killed by police. I want to end that crisis too.
Quick follow-up. Have you been to any of the protests or the quote-unquote riots partaking in Colorado recently?
I wouldn't call them a riot. In fact, I'm going to another protest tomorrow. I was in Civic Center Park last weekend, and then I helped actually clean up from one of the protests the night before. But I want to defend the right to peacefully protest. I was appalled by Donald Trump's decision to turn the police on a crowd of peaceful protesters using tear gas and rubber bullets so that he could stage a photo op. But yes, this is a movement that I'm deeply committed to, not just in word, but in deed.
Next question. In your term as Speaker of the State House, why did you not pass police reform like Senate Bill 217 that is currently making its way through the state Senate now?
Yeah, that's a fair challenge, and I don't have a good answer to it. I will tell you, I am fully committed to the sort of legislative efforts that you're describing and to the same kind of action at a federal level. And I credit the protesters who are galvanizing the country right now for putting this issue front and center before state, local, and federal lawmakers. And I wish we had taken more action on my watch. We did pass some laws to try to strengthen the ban on racial profiling, and other corrupt practices. But clearly, we did not do enough on any of these issues.
A quick follow-up. Do you think these state, federal, and local lawmakers who support these police reforms should refund donations taken from organizations like the Fraternal Order of Police?
Well, I'll leave that decision to the lawmakers themselves. I saw President Garcia, Senate President Leroy Garcia made that decision himself. We haven't gotten any such contributions in our campaign. And for that matter, we're not taking money from any political action committees as well.
So earlier you mentioned reform as far as police violence goes. In office, what would your top criminal justice reform be?
Other than the police reforms that we're talking about, do you mean?
Yeah, or you could elaborate on both.
Yeah, so I'll talk first about the policies that we've laid out today. And if you go to andrewromanoff.com/priorities, you can see a dozen proposals that we're making in order to end police violence. That includes not only a ban on chokeholds or strangleholds, but also requirements for comprehensive reporting and the use of body cameras, the formation of independent, effective oversight bodies with the authority to hold police officers accountable, a requirement on the part of officers to intervene and stop other officers from engaging in violence or other forms of misconduct. I think we need full legal accountability, and we need to make sure that we recruit and hire and train a police force that reflects and respects the community it serves. So I'm all in on that agenda. When it comes to criminal justice reform, more broadly, I'll offer you a couple quick thoughts. I mentioned the work I did at Mental Health Colorado. And I think we can conclude as a country by this point that turning our jails and prisons into warehouses for people who face mental illness or drug addiction is the least therapeutic and most expensive decision we could make. So it's time instead to invest in the prevention and treatment of mental health and substance use disorders instead of simply criminalizing that problem and watching so many folks incarcerated as a result. More specifically, I think we ought to be willing as well to invest in the sorts of programs that reduce the recidivism rate. When I was in the State House, we saw something like 50% of the people who were incarcerated reoffend within 3 years of release or parole. The rate was even higher among folks who were behind bars but faced a serious mental illness. They were reoffending at a rate of 80% within 12 months. So I sponsored legislation, just to give you one example, that helped people in those circumstances get back on a course of treatment before they were released or paroled, instead of sending them out of prison with a wing and a prayer and hoping that they would find a way to get mental health care on their own. That approach didn't work. And I think the policy that I promoted is more effective. And I want to make the same commitment as a senator, not just to mental health and substance use treatment, but to job training, to literacy, to support with housing, all the sorts of investments that we know reduce the likelihood that someone will reoffend.
All right, next question. What are you going to do to address the widespread systematic racism we see in the U.S., such as mass incarceration, disparities in access to healthcare, and school segregation, some of which you've already answered?
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the fundamental moral tests of our time. And we talked a little bit about police reform, since police brutality and violence take a disproportionate toll on African Americans. We talked a little bit about the work I did against employment discrimination. I'll just give you one example there. We have laws on the books today that say it is illegal to fire or refuse to hire somebody, for example, on account of their race. But in practice, that sort of discrimination still takes place, in part because we have not strengthened the enforcement of those civil rights laws. The technique that we used in the state civil rights agency where I worked is called testing. It's often used in the housing market. We paired one African-American young man and a white counterpart to pose as job applicants and then go out and apply for jobs. They're called testers. And we found that time after time, the African-American kept getting turned down in favor of his white counterpart, whose job credentials, by the way, since we were able to create them for this exercise, were weaker. There's no reason that the white applicant should have been hired other than the discrimination that we found. And I think we need similarly aggressive and creative ways to ferret out discrimination in the labor market and in housing and banking and lending and other means. We ought to address the disparities in healthcare, as you asked about, and make sure that we recruit African-American professionals into that field, since they're often shortchanged. Again, my work focused mostly in the last 4 years on mental health care, but we know that it is often at the root of everything else. And too many families, including African-Americans in the United States, are not getting the mental health or substance use services they need. So this has to be not just a national conversation. Talk is cheap, but it has to be accompanied by action in every single field. One last point I'll make, you pointed to the role of desegregation, and by some estimates, schools in America are more segregated now than they were even 40 years ago. So I think we need to make a commitment as a country to end segregation as well.
In a recent criminal justice forum that you and your opponent, Governor Hickenlooper, attended, Governor Hickenlooper, when asked about what Black Lives Matter means to him, said, quote, "Black Lives Matter means every life matters." He later walked this back, saying he, quote, "tripped over" his words. Do you think the comments Governor Hickenlooper made were wrong?
Yes.
Why?
Well, it's true, of course, that every life matters. I don't think anybody would deny that. But to suggest that that's what Black Lives Matter means is a fundamental misunderstanding of this movement, this cause, the right, and the recognition that African Americans have been and continue to be subjected to oppression, discrimination, a way to dehumanize them, devalue their lives. That is not simply confined to centuries ago. It persists. I think that's the point of saying Black Lives Matter. Again, it doesn't do us enough to say it if we don't actually act that way. But no, I think, as Hick himself seemed to acknowledge afterwards, those two sentences, those two phrases are not the same.
All right, and now moving on to our next topic of discussion, which is climate change and environmental justice. To start off, we can all agree here that climate change is a real and legitimate issue that needs to be addressed. So what will you do to ensure that this crisis is handled?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. And I'm glad, Charlotte, that you said we can all agree, because there's still some folks in the other camp who seem unclear on the evidence. And it is a source of not just frustration to me, but real outrage, because the science is overwhelming. I won't dwell on the point, but I will quote a climate scientist who said, "A thermometer is neither liberal nor conservative." I mean, the temperatures are going up. You can see the sea levels rising. You can see we've destroyed more of the polar ice caps, to take one example, in the last 20 years than the previous 10,000. And I tell audiences all the time, even if for some reason you didn't care about our ability to survive on this hotter planet as humans, you might take some sympathy for the other million species we've driven to the point of extinction. They didn't sign up for this, but they don't get to vote. We're the only animals who do. And it's a good thing, by the way, because if they could, those other species would probably vote us off of this global island. You asked what I can do about it, or what we should do about it, and I'm glad you did, because it is a central pillar of our campaign. I support a plan, a vision called the Green New Deal. It is an aggressive effort to replace fossil fuels with renewable energy, to stop spending $650 billion a year, as we do now, in direct and indirect subsidies on oil and gas and coal, and instead put that money into solar and wind and other alternative energy sources, transform our electrical grid, our building codes, our transportation system, help fossil fuel workers themselves, this is key, take jobs in the clean energy economy, and help protect frontline communities, like those in the United States that have been subjected to runaway oil and gas development. This is a real point of difference in this race, and I want to speak as plainly as I can. Cory Gardner sits on the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, has taken more money from the fossil fuel industry than, to my knowledge, at least all but one other member of Congress, and has voted to gut our environmental laws and block climate action. He's a lost cause. But there are real differences even in the Democratic primary. I'm running against a former governor who sued communities that tried to restrict fracking and literally drank the fracking fluid. It's not a metaphor, just not a good idea. John Hickenlooper and Cory Gardner both take money from the fossil fuel industry, hundreds of thousands of dollars in the course of their careers. I don't. And so when I run against Cory Gardner in the fall, I think I will present a clearer contrast. I support the Green New Deal. He and Hick oppose it. I don't take money from the fossil fuel industry like they do. And frankly, I just don't think we have much time left to accelerate our transition to a clean energy economy.
So just a quick follow-up, how do you plan to facilitate this transition to renewable energy?
Well, we need to provide some support for the folks whose jobs are already being dislocated along the way in the fossil fuel industry. I'll share with you a conversation I had, for example, with a group of pipe fitters up in Adams County. These are folks in some cases who are working in the oil and gas industry. They did not ask me whether the climate crisis was a hoax, because unlike the president, they know it's not. What they asked me instead was, will you help us get the skills we need, the training we need, the support we need to take jobs in the clean energy economy so that we can continue to support our families and pay our bills? I said yes. We should say yes. And we shouldn't treat people like collateral damage or casualties of this transition. And I think to a great extent, the workers I'm describing can already see the transition coming, because the market itself was making solar and wind cost competitive with oil and gas, even before the pandemic and the market response cut the legs out from the industry. So I am deeply committed to increasing employment opportunities. It's one of the central planks of the Green New Deal. And I'm excited about the opportunity. We could put millions of Americans to work building this clean energy infrastructure. We should take a page from the original New Deal. For example, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which FDR created. We can now create a climate conservation corps and exercise global leadership in this field, as we should.
Governor Hickenlooper has attacked the Green New Deal as being a, quote, massive government expansion and, quote,
Yes.
Socialism. What is your response to these criticisms?
I think it's ridiculous and counterproductive and familiar if you listen to Republican attacks. I just didn't realize a Democrat would be parroting them. Yeah, look, I've heard John say that. In fact, he's figured out a way to get to the right of Cory Gardner on this issue, which is really hard to do. He describes the entire agenda that you and I are discussing today, a Green New Deal, Medicare for all, the rest of this progressive platform. In his words, you can look it up. Mr. Hickenlooper said, these are the discredited ideas of Karl Marx and Joseph Stalin. I don't know if you've covered that bit of Soviet history yet, but I mean, Stalin, it's outrageous. And I know it's going to be tough to pass a Green New Deal given the power of the fossil fuel industry and the Republican resistance. It will be impossible if we have to fight Democrats who are echoing them.
One quick follow-up. Earlier, you mentioned Governor Hickenlooper's donations from the fossil fuel industry. Do you think these donations cloud his judgment on this issue?
Yes, I can't say how he comes to the views he holds. But the truth is, if you take money from the nation's biggest polluters, they presumably want something in return. And that's why we signed the No Fossil Fuel Money pledge. I think it's a problem in Congress, not confined, unfortunately, to just one political party. If the same folks who are supposed to be regulating these industries are also being subsidized by them. I mentioned earlier the need we have to end the subsidies we provide for fossil fuels. I think it's equally important in some ways for us to end the subsidies that the fossil fuel industry provides for politicians. And it's not just in the fossil fuel industry. The same dynamic is at play in the healthcare debate that we're having, the insurance companies, the drug companies. It's essentially a pay-to-play political system that sells Senate seats to the highest bidder and both corrupts Congress and sours most people about participating in the process altogether.
All right, next question. As we all know, climate change disproportionately affects communities of color and low-income households. What will you do to ensure that there's environmental justice?
Yeah, that's a really important question, both for the United States and our international commitment to this cause. I'll give you a couple examples. I mentioned earlier that a lot of frontline communities, particularly low-income communities and communities of color, are in the path of oil and gas development. I visited some of these places in the fracking zone, and you can look For example, at Suncor, spewing hydrogen cyanide into a low-income community north of Denver, or at the site around Belo Romero in Greeley, where a low-income community is subject to this risk that a white community was able to avoid because it had more political power. So to my mind, your ability to breathe, to drink water, to avoid the birth defects, which we've seen increase in these fracking sites, those things ought to be guaranteed. The right to a future we can breathe in ought to be guaranteed to every American. And that means not simply putting politicians in place who owe their allegiance to their corporate contributors, but instead replacing those politicians, Democrat or Republican, with people who actually put our public health, our environment, our lives first. That's the kind of senator I aim to be. In the meantime, we got to make sure that we end these practices that are endangering our public health, that we mitigate the damage, that we make communities whole, and that we give them not just a seat in the audience, but a seat at the table when these decisions are being made in the first place. So one of the reasons throughout this campaign, we have been hell-bent on crisscrossing the state, both physically when that was possible and virtually now that it's not, so that we can engage in as many of these conversations as possible and empower, to the best of my ability, the people who are being affected and who ought to be in charge.
All right, and now moving on to the final topic of mental health. We've already touched on this a little bit, but the rate of teen suicide has increased by nearly 60% in the last 3 years in Colorado, making it the cause of death in 1 in 5 adolescents. Why do you think this is happening, and what will you do to address the mental health crisis we're currently facing?
Yeah, I'm going to ask you the same question, actually, because you're closer to this age group, and it is a crisis that has afflicted my family. Although she wasn't a teenager, my first cousin, who was like a kid sister to me, died by suicide on New Year's Day in 2015. I'll share with you a bit about this story because it shapes my perspective. I was really close to my little cousin. I would do anything to bring her back. I can't do that. And when on New Year's Day she walked into our backyard while her mom and dad and I were celebrating the holiday and put a gun to her head, it is, as you can imagine, an event that has reshaped our lives forever. Someone told me when you die by suicide, you don't end your pain, you transfer it. So we're going to spend the rest of our lives trying to figure out how we missed the signs of her mental illness, and we'll never know because she hid them really well. I think what we need to do instead is reduce and eliminate the stigma that still surrounds mental illness, make it clear that mental illness is not a character flaw, it's a medical condition, and it's not a death sentence. At least it doesn't have to be. It's treatable. I led the charge at Mental Health Colorado to get more schools equipped with the resources they need to screen and refer to treatment kids who need help, as 20% of kids do. That means school mental health professionals like psychologists and social workers and counselors. It means better training, not just for teachers, but for cafeteria workers and bus drivers and coaches and other school staff to spot the early warning signs of these disorders. It means engaging parents and families in this conversation. It means investing in social and emotional learning. 100% of kids and plenty of adults would benefit from that approach as well. And ultimately, I think it means integrating mental health into the primary care system instead of segregating those services, sending you one place, in other words, to treat your body and a different place to treat your brain. Instead of doing that, we ought to recognize you're the same person and get you the care you need from head to toe. So that's my commitment. You asked what accounts for this uptick. I have seen some speculation, and you can only call these theories, I think, at this point, that an increase in the use of social media and smartphone technology happens to correspond with, if not cause, an uptick in the diagnosis of anxiety and depression and other mental health disorders. It used to be that when you were bullied at school, you could go home. But now the cyberbullying surrounds you 24 hours a day and invades every corner of your life. And I think that's part of the crisis, too, that we need to combat.
All right, next question. This one you've already answered a little bit, but how do you plan on expanding mental health care? And will it be covered in your Medicare for All plans?
So the second question, yes, it has to be an essential part of that plan. And not just on paper, but in practice. Today, under the Affordable Care Act, and for the last 10 years, mental health and substance use services are considered essential benefits. That's good, but any law is just a paper promise unless you actually enforce it. And in practice, people who face mental health or substance use services are being forced to go out of network more often, travel farther, wait longer, pay more, or go without care altogether compared to people who face physical illnesses. So the promise of what's called mental health parity, equal treatment, in other words, for mental health and physical care, that's a promise we haven't delivered. And in part, it's because insurance companies don't pay mental health professionals as much as they pay other healthcare providers. There's a pay gap of about 20% nationally and 40% here in Colorado. We need to close that gap. Second, I'd say we need to make sure that in places where a mental health provider is not physically available, we can get one there virtually. So I want to support not only loan forgiveness programs and other financial incentives to get mental health professionals to rural Colorado and other parts of rural America, I also want to deliver high-speed broadband internet access. I mean, it's 2020. We should finally be at the point where every community is connected. And it's apparent in this pandemic particularly that we're not there yet. It's not easy to tell somebody to go, I mean, it's easy, but not sufficient to tell somebody to go work from home or study from home if they can't log on. And there's too many communities I know here in this state that don't have reliable internet connection. It is in many ways what the highway system was to the 1950s or the railroads were to the 1800s. It's the lifeline to a modern economy and to health and education and justice and other essential services. So yes, in answer to your question, Elijah, I think we should be willing to make this investment and to recognize that we're already making it just in the wrong end. We're spending so much money on our criminal justice system. I talked to a sheriff who said, I run the largest mental hospital in my community. It's called the county jail. So waiting until people run into trouble with the law or watching them lose their jobs or self-medicate with drugs or alcohol or end up homeless, I mean, that is barbaric and colossally expensive. It'd be much cheaper, the evidence shows, to invest in prevention and early intervention than to use our jails or prison cells, our emergency rooms, or our cemeteries as destinations for people with untreated mental illness.
Now to our final question. Mail-in ballots go out in a few days, and the primary will be on June 30th. So what makes you both the best Democrat and the best candidate for the United States Senate in Colorado?
Well, first, thank you for this opportunity. And you're right, ballots go out on Monday. I believe I bring to this race both the strongest record of legislative leadership and the deepest sense of urgency, the most compelling agenda to address each of the challenges that you all have very wisely laid out. I'm committed to support the Democratic nominee in this race no matter what. But I believe I would be a better senator. And apparently so does John Hickenlooper, because he said he would be terrible at this job, wasn't cut out for it, didn't want to run, and would hate doing it. I believe him. I've got a better ability, I think, to debate Cory Gardner, because in part I already have. I spent 4 years in the House with him, duking it out in the Colorado legislature. Mr. Hickenlooper, as I mentioned, has skipped, including today, 20 candidate forums now. And I tell folks, if you want a senator who doesn't show up or answer questions, you've got one named Gardner. We don't need to replicate that approach. I'm proud to have earned endorsements in the course of this campaign from 375 elected officials across the state, county commissioners, mayors, school board members, city council members, legislators I've served with, by the way, even on the other side of the aisle. I'll just share with you one last story because I'm proud of this endorsement in particular. A few weeks after I announced my candidacy for the U.S. Senate, I got a text from a former colleague of mine named Mike May. I doubt you know his name, but I do, because he led the opposition to me. When I was the Speaker of the House, he was the minority leader. He's a Republican from Parker. He served in the State House with Cory Gardner and me. They were both on the other side of the aisle. He said to me, my wife and I would like to support your campaign. And I said, well thanks, Mike, but I'm a Democrat. I just wanted to remind him. And he said, I know, because he remembered that. And then he said this. He said, my country matters more than my party, and we would be honored to call you our senator. I thought, well, first I thought, we're going to put you on TV, because that is a great endorsement. But then I thought, it's exactly the sentiment we're missing, this notion that your country comes first. So one of the reasons I believe I've got the best chance to beat Cory Gardner and to represent our state is because I've demonstrated an ability to bring together a broad coalition of allies, of leaders, of young people who all share my determination to put this country on the right track, not just to return to business as usual, but to really restructure so many of the systems that have brought us to this point. I think even though a generic Democrat may beat Cory Gardner by double digits, as the polls show, we need more than a generic Democrat in this seat. We need somebody who will act as if our lives depend on it, because they do.
Thank you. That is all the questions we have. Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing your time. I also wanted to say to each of you, to Elijah, to Charlotte, and to Spencer, thank you for your leadership. Thanks for taking the initiative to organize this forum. I'm sorry the other guy didn't show up. He's otherwise occupied today, I gather. But I am committed, not just in the course of this campaign, but as a senator, to continue these conversations with you, to engage more young people in my office, should I get one, in the U.S. Senate, and to help harness the energy that you all are already demonstrating to tackle the problems we face. For the sake of the viewers who are joining us, we're doing these virtual town hall meetings every Friday at noon Mountain Time, every Tuesday at 5, although we may have to adjust our schedule next week, because for the first time since joining the race 9.5 months ago or so, Mr. Hickenlooper actually has agreed to participate in a debate, and that takes place on Tuesday night. We're having 2 debates next week, Tuesday night and Wednesday night, both on TV. We'll put the details on our website at andrewromanoff.com. It's where you can find the rest of our priorities. And since this is the last thing I'll get to say, I'd be honored to earn your vote. These are jobs nobody's entitled to. You got to earn them. So I hope when you get a ballot next week, you'll vote for me. If you want to get involved in our campaign, you can do that as well by going to andrewromanoff.com or chipping in.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Have a great weekend. Stay well.
You as well.